During World War II, when Fred Karamatsu contested an order that all Japanese Americans report to internment camps, the court ruled that the nation's needed to protect itself outweighed the civil liberties of Americans of Japanese descent. And midway through the modest gay rights era, when Michael Hardwick challenged a Georgian law that made it illegal for him to have sex with a man in his own home, the court upheld the law and insisted that one of Hardwick's most important constitutional claims was, at best, facetious. Of course, the Supreme Court does not always side with injustice or with society's most powerful sectors. It ordered the South to end racial segregation and recognize the right of same-sex couples to marry, and it was corrected some of its worst mistakes. It reversed the ruling against Plessy after 58 years and against Hardwick after 17. Overall, however, its record is so deficient uh, that a prominent law school dean recently concluded the court has frequently failed throughout American history at its most important tasks, at its most important moments. He made the observation after more than 30 years of teaching constitutional law in a book he called The Case Against the Supreme Court. There will always be differences of opinion over which rulings should be on the list of worst decisions and how they should be ranked, but there can be no doubt that the Buck versus Bell must have been a prominent place. In its aftermath, not only was Carrie Buck sterilized against her will, but states across the country sterilized another 60 to 70,000 Americans. Um, Many of the victims were, like Carrie, perfectly normal, both mentally and physically, and they desperately wanted to have children. The reach of Carrie, the reach of Buck versus Bell extended beyond the United States. The Nazi Party, which was on the rise in Germany, used America as the model of its own eugenic sterilization program. The Supreme Court's ruling influence, the Urbasunheitsgericht, the hereditary health courts that decided who should be forcibly sterilized, and at the Nuremberg trials that followed World War II, Nazis who had carried out 375,000 forced eugenic sterilizations cited Buck versus Bell and in defense of their actions. While many of the court's decisions are now central parts of American history, Buck versus Bell is titled Buck versus Bell is little remembered today. Even in constitutional law courses, it is rarely discussed it's mentioned only in passing. The second edition of American Constitutional Law by the Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe, which weighed in at 1,778 pages, devoted just half a sentence and a footnote to the case. A recent 953-page biography of Brandeis, written by another respected law professor and hailed by some critics as definitive, did not try to explain why the legendary progressive joined the Buck versus Bell majority. It relegated the case to a single sentence and a footnote. Many of those who would airbrush Buck versus Bell from history offer a simple explanation. It is an anomaly. The Supreme Court, they argued, was briefly caught up in eugenics, but it was short-lived, one-time mistake. Today there are rights that did not exist in 1927, including rights of liberty and privacy. That would produce a different outcome. The ruling can be dismissed in half a sentence. The argument goes because it is outside the sweep of American constitutional law, and the issues it raises are ones the nation long ago put behind it. This rationale for consigning Buck versus Bell to the dustbin of history has serious flaws. The first is that there is nothing outdated about the case's subject matter. Oregon ordered its last forced sterilization in 1981, and up until 1983, its Board of Eugenics was still functioning, though it had been renamed the Board of Social Protection. Yeah, of course they did. In 2013, investigative reporters discovered that nearly 150 female prisoners in California had been sterilized between 2006 2006 and 2010, not always with the woman's consent. More broadly, the 21st century is being hailed as the century of biology, an era that experts will say be defined by the new biology of genome research, with a vastly deeper understanding of the genetic blueprint for individual humans. Questions at the intersection of genetics and law, including to what degree the state and private sector should be able to use people's genetic markers against them, will be more common and more complex. Another reason Buck versus Bell cannot be left in the past is that, unlike so many of the Supreme Court's worst rulings, it has never been overturned. In the later case, the court struck down on Oklahoma law providing for sterilization of certain criminals, but it did so because of its objection to the definition of which crimes would lead to sterilization. The court did not overturn or even limit Buck versus Bell. Or after the ruling, the states continued to sterilize thousands of people. In the 21st century, federal courts are still ruling that the government has the right to forcibly sterilize, and citing Buck versus Bell. Finally, Buck versus Bell remains critically important because its deepest subject is a timeless one: power, and how those who have used it against those who do not. Carrie was at the bottom of the nation's economic and social hierarchies. In her plea to the court, she was asking for protection from powerful people and institutions that threatened to do her harm. Throughout the history of American law, that position has not been a good one to be in. The Code of Hammurabi is one of the world's great legal artifacts. When French archaeologists discovered it in 1901, they learned that ancient Babylonians had strikingly sophisticated legal system. The code, which was carved onto a black stone slab, included 282 distinct laws conferring such modern-seeming doctrines as liability for negligent acts and the presumption of innocence. As significant as these individual rules was the code's eloquent statement of its own purpose. As significant as these individual rules was the code's eloquent statement of its own purpose, contained in the preface, to bring out the rule of righteousness in the land so that the strong should not harm the weak. That simple idea remains more than 3,500 years later, the law's highest calling. It is a vision that the American legal system has failed to live up to all too often. Dred Scott, Homer Plessy, Fred Korematsu, and Michael Hardwick all were weaker parties, unjustly harmed by the stronger ones, who came to the Supreme Court seeking justice. In each case, the court sided with the strong.